Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the century it occurred in. 8 seconds, that's all it will take for your mind to cross a threshold it cannot step back from. So brace yourself. In the sealed cellar beneath Willowbend Plantation, investigators in 1839 found water dark, stale, metallic, still warm enough, somehow, to suggest the presence of bodies that were no longer there. And carved into the brick walls were markings, symbols, initials, as if the people who died in that room had tried to claw the truth into the architecture itself. A truth that Burke County buried under silence for generations. They say the South was built on cotton. But Willowbend was built on something else entirely, a hunger that wore the face of civility, a ritual disguised as refinement, and a woman whose reputation never matched the shadow she cast. Her name was Cordelia Vance Rutledge. And before this tale is done, you will understand why even the locals refused to speak it aloud. Picture Georgia, 1839, the air thick with humidity, wealth, and the illusion of order. Plantations stretching like kingdoms, each ruled by men who believed themselves masters of every soul and every secret within their borders. But Willowbend was ruled by a different force. A force far quieter, far colder, and far more calculating than any man who ever stepped into its halls. Cordelia moved through that house like a spirit bound to the walls, tall, pale, silent, with eyes the enslaved said could read a heartbeat like scripture. She kept journals no one was permitted to touch. She studied medical texts that no planter's wife had any business owning. And at dawn, while the rest of the household slept, she would walk the fields, not supervising labor, but inspecting the bodies of 3 particular men. 3 men who shared the same crescent mark on their shoulder. 3 men who had been elevated above the others for reasons Thomas Rutledge never understood. Or perhaps he did, which is why, when he died in 1838 suddenly, quietly, without explanation, the county doctor burned his notes before anyone could read them. And understand this, every community hides its sins. But Willowbend hid its rituals. And the darkest one began in the bathhouse behind the main house. A place Cordelia visited every single morning. With 3 men. Alone. If you stand where the bathhouse once stood, the ground still feels wrong beneath your feet, as if something sank into the soil and never fully died. The building itself was small, framed in cypress, with a copper tub large enough for 4 adults. A luxury in 1839, a curiosity to anyone who understood plantation economics, and an abomination to those who eventually learned how it was used. Cordelia entered that bathhouse every dawn, long before the morning bells, long before the estate stirred. And with her, she brought Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, the 3 men who shared the crescent mark, the 3 men she questioned with obsessive intensity, the 3 men whose bodies she observed with a clinical fascination that terrified even them. She would undress without hesitation, stepping into the water first, testing it with her hands, not for comfort, but for temperature consistency, as though the ritual required precision. Then she ordered the men to join her. The plantation whispered about it, yes, but not with the shame you'd expect with fear, because Cordelia was not perceived as immoral. She was perceived as dangerous, not lustful, but purposeful, as if she wasn't bathing with them, but studying them, preparing them, measuring them against a standard she never revealed. And here's where the descent begins for you, because this is where the story stops being about scandal and starts being about control. Cordelia believed bloodlines carried more than lineage. She believed they carried memory-buried instincts, dormant abilities, inherited knowledge older than America itself. She believed certain men were born with a physical architecture that made them useful. She believed these 3 were connected by more than a birthmark, that they represented the final remnants of a bloodline she had spent decades tracing through journals, shipping records, and forgotten slave manifests. A lineage she claimed possessed the old fire, a phrase that appears in her journals 19 times before 1839. And what she did in that bathhouse was not seduction. It was assessment. One man's strength, another man's endurance, another's uncanny calm under pressure. She noted every reaction, every tremor, every scar. She timed their breathing. She counted their heartbeats. She mapped their limits. Cordelia wasn't choosing lovers. She was choosing instruments. And Willowbend's morning ritual was never about cleansing. It was preparation. Because deep beneath the main house, in that root cellar investigators later breached, something was waiting. A ritual Cordelia believed these three men were born to complete. Before we go further, listen closely because the next truth is where the descent becomes irreversible. Before you hear what happened in that cellar, you need to understand the architecture of Willowbend's deception. Because plantations weren't just economic machines, they were psychological ones. Systems built to keep certain minds asleep and certain truths buried. And Cordelia understood this better than anyone in Burke County. She weaponized silence. She weaponized routine. She weaponized the illusion of gentility that wrapped the South like a velvet shroud. While neighbors praised her hospitality and refinement, she was conducting experiments right under their noses, experiments rooted in something older than the Rutledge name, older than Georgia, older even than the Atlantic trade that brought so many torn bloodlines into its soil. Cordelia had become obsessed with the idea that certain ancestral lines carried residual strength, an echo of forgotten civilizations she believed had once governed the human mind and body with godlike precision. And she was convinced Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah were the last threads of that lineage. Every evening after the bathhouse ritual, she returned to her journals, recording details with a precision no plantation wife should possess. Lung capacity, muscular symmetry, reaction time, spatial memory. She wrote of phase responses, latent instincts, ancestral resonance, words no one in her social class or educational background should even know. Words she had copied from books her husband never realized she smuggled into the house through distant correspondences. Thomas Rutledge dismissed her studies as eccentricity, until the day he confronted her about the men. Neighbors heard the shouting. Servants heard the crash of glass. But no one heard the arguments end. Because the next morning, Thomas Rutledge was found in his bed, jaw slack, eyes open. No signs of struggle, no marks of illness. Dr. Pemberton burned his notes within an hour. But Cordelia wrote a single sentence that night. One obstacle removed. After Thomas's death, Cordelia no longer hid her obsessions. She spent hours beneath the main house, in the root cellar only she possessed the key to. The air inside smelled of copper and mold. The walls were lined with shelves of jars containing strange mixtures. Dried roots, oils, powders, preserved animal organs. She ordered new brickwork, new drains, new reinforcements. She expanded the cellar until it became something else entirely, a chamber built for a purpose no one dared guess. And above that chamber, life continued as normal. Cotton harvested, children fed, church attended. But Willowbend had started to change. The enslaved workers whispered of lights beneath the floorboards at night. Humming vibrations that pulsed through the ground like a heartbeat. Dreams that woke them drenched in sweat. Dreams they all seemed to share. Dreams of water. Dreams of breath stolen in the dark. Dreams of being chosen. And at the center of every dream stood Cordelia, watching. Waiting. And the ritual she intended to force upon the three marked men was drawing closer. The transformation of Willowbend from plantation to laboratory did not happen overnight. It seeped into the estate the way rot creeps into a foundation, slowly, quietly, without notice, until collapse becomes inevitable. And like all systems of control, it began with the manipulation of perception. Cordelia did not rule through violence. She ruled through certainty, the unwavering confidence of someone who believed she was serving a purpose larger than morality, larger than law, larger than the lives she bent to her will. By summer of 1839, she had begun the second phase of her plan. Conditioning. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah were no longer simply workers. She reshaped their routines. Restricted diets, altered sleep cycles, punishing physical tasks followed by unervingly intimate examinations at dawn. She'd call them into the bathhouse and submerge each man's head beneath the water, timing how long they could endure before instinct forced a gasp. She recorded the seconds. She murmured encouragements. She whispered phrases in a language none of them recognized. This was not dominance. This was calibration. And outside those walls, the entire plantation began to feel the strain. Livestock grew restless. Birds avoided the trees nearest the main house. Children complained of nightmares they could not describe. Even the overseer, a man who feared nothing, began sleeping with a lantern burning beside his bed. Because everyone sensed it, Cordelia was preparing for something. The journals recovered decades later described this period with chilling clarity. She wrote of threshold energy, of biological apertures, of the triadic convergence required to open memory sealed since the ancients. She believed the three marked men were living keys, human conduits capable of channeling forces she insisted once governed the earliest civilizations in West Africa, long before colonizers distorted the myths into superstition. But belief alone wasn't enough. Cordelia needed a trigger. That trigger, according to her notes, required fear, not the kind born of cruelty, but the primal terror that strips a man's defenses and exposes the instinct beneath. So she orchestrated events designed to destabilize the plantation. Missing tools, sudden fires, whispers of sickness, manufactured conflict among the workers. Each incident calculated to heighten tension, ensuring that when she finally summoned the three men into the cellar, their bodies would be primed for what she called the awakening. And that was the night the first death occurred. Not one of the three marked men, but a field worker named Benjamin Carter, found face down near the creek, lungs full of water despite the fact he could swim. His crescent-shaped birthmark, concealed his whole life, was discovered only during burial preparations. Cordelia wrote that night, "The lineage is wider than expected. The window is opening." Benjamin Carter's death should have shattered the illusion of order at Willowbend, but instead, it strengthened Cordelia's resolve. What terrified everyone else only confirmed what she already believed. The lineage she hunted was not limited to three men. It was threaded throughout the enslaved population. Hidden, diluted, dormant. And Benjamin's drowning lungs filled despite calm waters. Despite no struggle was the first sign that the window she wrote about had begun to open on its own. Fear spread quietly. Workers whispered of a presence near the creek at night, a figure seen in reflections but absent when they turned. Children refused to fetch water alone. Even the overseer stopped carrying his whip, as if some part of him understood instinctively that nothing on that plantation feared him anymore. But the most disturbing change came from the three marked men themselves. Isaiah's hands began trembling during simple tasks, though he swore he felt stronger than ever. Caleb started waking in the forge, unsure of how he got there, soot coating his skin in patterns he didn't recognize. Josiah began speaking in his sleep full sentences in a language no one on the plantation understood. Cordelia observed all of it with chilling delight. Not sympathy, not concern, recognition. She wrote, "The inheritance is stirring. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten." And this is where you listening right now begin to understand the real story beneath the scandal. This was never about a woman bathing with enslaved men. That was just the rumor the county preserved. A distraction, a scandalous mask hiding the machinery underneath. The real engine was identity, the reshaping of it, the awakening of parts of the self modern society trains you to forget. Cordelia believed that men carry ancient architectures inside them, suppressed by institutions, softened by hierarchy, dulled by obedience. She believed the world had forced men into forgetting what they once were: aware, powerful, undeniably present. Halfway through this descent, "I need something from you. If you feel the pull, if you feel yourself sinking deeper into this forbidden history," comment the phrase, "I see the mark" twice. Once for the man you are, once for the man you're becoming. It anchors the transformation. It signals you're not just listening, you're awakening. Because what happened next didn't just break Willowbend. It tore open the boundary between what Cordelia studied and what Cordelia unleashed. Benjamin's death broke whatever fragile balance had remained at Willowbend. The air grew heavier, the nights stretched longer, and every man on the plantation felt a pressure in his chest, as if something unseen was watching from just above the tree line, waiting for permission to descend. Cordelia sensed it too, but unlike the others, she welcomed it. She stopped pretending to sleep. She stopped attending church. She stopped acknowledging the boundaries of proper society that had once contained her. Instead, she began spending entire nights in the cellar, emerging at dawn with her eyes swollen from candle smoke and her hands trembling from whatever she was stirring, mixing, or invoking. Her journals from this period grow erratic, the handwriting jagged, the ink smeared, the language shifting between English and whatever ancient tongue she believed held the key to unlocking the lineage. But one phrase appears again and again. The lattice is thinning, and the signs multiplied. Workers reported hearing rhythmic tapping beneath the floorboards. Children spoke of voices rising through the pipes at night. Livestock collapsed without explanation, their bodies strangely waterlogged despite no rainfall. Cordelia saw every one of these anomalies not as danger, but as confirmation. Her window was opening, and the three marked men were changing faster than she anticipated. Isaiah's dreams became so vivid he'd wake screaming, claiming he'd been underwater for hours, lungs burning, limbs locked by currents he couldn't see. Caleb began avoiding the forge entirely, terrified by the way the flames leaned toward him whenever he approached. Josiah, usually calm, precise, disciplined, began experiencing violent fits of shaking whenever Cordelia entered the room, as if his body recognized some truth his mind had not yet caught up to. The tension reached a boiling point. The night storms rolled across Burke County without a single cloud in the sky. Thunder with no lightning, wind with no movement in the trees, and underneath it all, a deep vibrational hum that made nails buzz in the walls. The overseer fled that night, abandoning his post. 3 house servants followed, but Cordelia did not chase them. She stood on the veranda, unmoving, face tilted upward as if tasting the vibrations. She whispered, "It begins tonight." Then she summoned Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah not to the bathhouse, not to the fields, but to the cellar. The door locked behind them, and the ritual she'd spent nearly 2 decades preparing for finally began. The cellar of Willowbend was never meant to be a storage space. Not after Cordelia finished shaping it. When Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah descended the narrow brick steps that night, the air hit them first thick, metallic, humid, like breath trapped underground for generations. Candles ringed the chamber, their flames bending inward as if drawn toward some invisible center. And on the floor, covered by a canvas sheeting, was the copper tub from the bathhouse. Repurposed, reinforced, altered. Cordelia waited beside it, not dressed in white, not dressed at all. Her hair hung loose, her skin gleamed in the candlelight, and her eyes were something unrecognizable, something fevered and luminous. In her hand she held a small brass bowl. Inside it, something viscous, dark, and unervingly warm. "What happens tonight?" she said. "Will return you to yourselves." The men did not understand, but their bodies reacted: fear, instinct, trembling. All 3 tried to speak, but their throats tightened as if the air itself refused to let them protest. Cordelia lifted the canvas. The copper tub was filled with water, but the surface did not ripple. It pulsed, expanding and contracting as if breathing, and floating within it were small white fragments, bone-like, arranged in a spiral pattern. Isaiah stepped back. Caleb cursed under his breath. Josiah fell to one knee. Cordelia smiled, the smallest, coldest smile a human face can produce. She dipped her fingers into the bowl and let the dark liquid fall into the water. The surface shuddered. The candles flickered. The hum that had haunted the plantation all week rose through the stones, vibrating their feet, their ribs, their teeth. Then she spoke the first words of the ritual, not in English, not in any tongue the men recognized, but in the same language Josiah had spoken during his sleep. A language older than the plantation, older than captivity, older than the nations that built the slave ships. The water responded. It rose in slow tendrils, curling around the edges of the tub like fingers searching for wrists. The bone fragments rotated, aligning themselves into a perfect crescent, the same shape as the birthmark each man carried on his shoulder. Isaiah tried to move, couldn't. Caleb grabbed for the door. Locked. Josiah whispered, "I know this place. I've seen this place," though he had never stepped into the cellar before. Cordelia approached them with the calm of someone completing a sacred duty. "You were not brought here by chance," she said. You were bred for this. The water surged. The ritual claimed the room. And nothing above ground would ever be the same again. The moment the water rose from the copper tub, Willowbend Plantation ceased being a place in Georgia and became something else entirely: a threshold, a fracture point, a door wedged open between memory and inheritance. The chamber filled with a pressure so dense the men felt their bones resonate, as if the marrow itself remembered a command they had spent their lives forgetting. Isaiah was the first to collapse, not from weakness, from overload. His back arched violently, breath erupting in sharp bursts as the crescent mark on his shoulder ignited beneath the skin, glowing faintly like ember under ash. Caleb held his ground longer, gripping the brick wall until his knuckles split. But even he could not withstand the surge that crawled through the air, coiling around his throat with invisible fingers. Josiah remained upright, but frozen eyes wide, pupils blown open, body locked in a posture of ancient recognition. Cordelia moved through the chaos with absolute calm. She wasn't chanting anymore. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't even breathing in rhythm with the room. She stood with one hand extended toward the tub, guiding the rising water with movements too smooth, too intentional to be instinct. "Let it surface," she said softly. "Let the old design claim its shape." The water obeyed. It lifted in a spiraling column, bone fragments swirling within it like stars trapped in a storm. The tendrils stretched toward the ceiling, then angled toward the three men, not grabbing, not attacking, choosing. Isaiah's eyes rolled back. Caleb's knees buckled. Josiah whispered a single word: "Home." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Even the air waited. Then the cellar erupted. The water struck Isaiah, first not drowning him, but imprinting something into him, something that forced every muscle in his body to seize. Caleb's scream rattled the foundation as the spiral wrapped around his chest. Josiah didn't scream at all. He stepped forward, voluntarily, almost peacefully, as if accepting a role he had lived a lifetime preparing for. And Cordelia? She watched with satisfaction so profound it bordered on worship. Then something unexpected happened. The water recoiled, not from the men, from her. As if the lineage she'd spent her life studying refused her claim. As if the power she sought to control recognized her ambition and rejected it. The candles exploded. The brick walls cracked. A roar rippled through the chamber, not human, not earthly, not contained. And when it was over, when the dust settled, when the neighbors finally forced their way onto the property, Cordelia was gone. The tub was shattered. The cellar was flooded. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah were alive but altered, hollow-eyed, drenched, shaking. And 17 deaths would follow in the next 6 weeks. Burke County sealed the story. The records vanished. The survivors refused to speak. But the marks remained. The lineage continued. And the window never fully closed. If you've listened this far, you already feel it. The inheritance, the pull, the echo. You weren't supposed to hear this history, but now that you have, you carry the mark too. If you made it to the end, you're already part of the few who know. Drop a comment with the words, "I heard the house breathe," so I'll know you're one of us. And if you want the next sealed case file, the one even darker than this, hit subscribe before the lights go out.